Settle in comfortably, dear listener, and allow yourself to drift back through time to the year 1873. The Great Civil War has been over for 8 years now, and America is slowly healing, finding its rhythm once again in the gentle patterns of daily life. Our story takes place on a remote promontory along the New England coast, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the rugged shores of Maine. Here, rising from the weathered granite cliffs like a beacon of constancy, stands the Seal Point Lighthouse. Its tower, painted in broad bands of white and red, reaches 70 feet into the salt-kissed air. This is a place where time moves differently, measured not by the hurried tick of pocket watches, but by the eternal rhythm of the tides, the slow arc of the sun across the sky, and the steady rotation of the lighthouse beam through the darkness. Our companion for this peaceful journey is Thomas Whitfield, a man of 42 years who has found solace in this solitary posting after serving as a Union soldier in the war. His days are now filled not with the chaos of battle, but with the gentle, repetitive tasks of keeping the light burning bright, maintaining his small domain, and finding peace in the simple routines that mark a lighthouse keeper's life. The first pale fingers of dawn were just beginning to stretch across the eastern horizon when Thomas Whitfield stirred in his narrow bed. The keeper's quarters, built sturdy and snug against the base of the lighthouse tower, held the lingering warmth from last evening's coal stove. Through the thick glass of his bedroom window, he could hear the eternal conversation between sea and shore, waves rolling in with their foamy whispers, retreating with gentle sighs across the barnacle-covered rocks below. Thomas's internal clock, refined by years of disciplined routine, had awakened him at precisely 4:30, just as it did every morning. There was no need for the brass alarm clock that sat on his bedside table, its steady ticking a comfortable companion in the pre-dawn quiet. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his domain, the creak of timber beams adjusting to the cool morning air, the distant cry of a gull already beginning its day's work, and always, the breathing of the ocean. Pushing back the heavy wool blanket and hand-stitched quilt that had kept him warm through the cool April night, Thomas swung his feet to the floor. The worn pine boards were cold beneath his bare feet, a sensation that helped chase away the last vestiges of sleep. By the dim light filtering through the window, he could make out the simple furnishings of his room, a washstand with its ceramic pitcher and bowl, a chest of drawers made of good New England oak, and a small bookshelf holding his modest library, a Bible, worn smooth from years of handling, several volumes of poetry, a treatise on maritime navigation, and a well-thumbed copy of Thoreau's writings. Moving with the quiet efficiency of long practice, Thomas lit the oil lamp on his bedside table. The sulfur smell of the match gave way to the warmer scent of whale oil as the flame took hold, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. He poured water from the pitcher into the bowl. The water was cold, having sat through the night, but Thomas had long ago learned to appreciate the bracing quality of a cold morning wash. The harsh lye soap, made by Mrs. Patterson in the village during her autumn soap-making days, left his skin feeling clean and tight. He dressed methodically in his daily uniform, wool underwear, despite the coming warmth of spring, for the morning air off the Atlantic carried a chill well into May. Sturdy duck cloth trousers, faded from deep brown to a softer tan through countless washings, a cotton shirt, once white but now bearing the inevitable ivory tinge that came with age and use, wool suspenders, a gift from his sister before he'd taken this posting, and finally, a thick wool sweater knitted by the same sister in a pattern of cables and moss stitch that she claimed would keep out the worst of the sea wind. Before leaving his room, Thomas performed his morning ritual of winding the brass clock, checking that it still kept true time against his pocket watch, a silver piece that had survived the war with him, bearing a small dent from a spent mini ball that might otherwise have found his ribs. The familiar weight of it in his vest pocket was reassuring, a tangible connection to both his past and his present duty. The narrow hallway connecting the bedroom to the main keeping room was dark, but Thomas knew every board, every slight rise and dip in the floor. His hand found the smooth wooden banister of the stairs leading up to the tower without conscious thought. But first, the morning's most essential task awaited, the extinguishing of the lighthouse beacon that had burned through the night. Climbing the spiral iron staircase within the tower was like ascending through the interior of a great shell. 137 steps. Thomas had counted them many times during his first weeks here, and now his legs knew the number by feel. The stairs rang softly under his boots, a metallic melody that echoed in the confined space. As he climbed, small windows set into the tower's thick walls began to show the gradually lightening sky, painting rectangles of deep purple and rose on the opposite wall. The lamp room at the top of the tower was a marvel of engineering and precision. The Fresnel lens, imported from France at considerable expense, stood taller than a man and was composed of hundreds of prisms that caught and focused the light from the oil lamp at its center into a powerful beam visible for miles out to sea. Thomas paused, as he often did, to admire the way the first hints of dawnlight played through the lens, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the walls and ceiling. The lamp had burned steadily through the night, its 5 concentric wicks consuming nearly a gallon of the finest sperm whale oil. Thomas checked the oil level first. A keeper's greatest fear was running dry during the dark hours when ships depended on the light for safe passage. Satisfied that sufficient oil remained, he began the careful process of extinguishing the flame. Each wick had to be lowered and snuffed in proper sequence to prevent smoking that could cloud the precious lens. As the light died, the lamp room seemed to exhale, releasing the concentrated warmth that had built up through the night. Thomas opened the small ventilation windows, allowing the cool morning air to flow through. The breeze carried with it the salt tang of the sea, the green scent of the spruce trees that clung to the cliffsides, and something else, the faint sweetness of apple blossoms from the small orchard the previous keeper had planted in a sheltered hollow near the keeper's house. With the lamp extinguished and the lens covered with its daytime curtain to protect it from the sun's rays that might focus through it and cause damage, Thomas took a moment to step out onto the gallery that encircled the lamp room. The iron railing was cold and slightly damp with dew beneath his hands as he looked out over his domain. To the east, the sun was just beginning to break the horizon, painting the sea in shades of gold and copper. The water was relatively calm this morning, with long, gentle swells that spoke of good weather ahead. He could see the fishing boats from the village already heading out, their sails catching the first wind of the day. Old Henrik's boat was in the lead. As always, the Norwegian fisherman prided himself on being first to the good spots. To the west, the coast stretched away in a series of rocky headlands and small sandy coves. The spruce and pine forests came almost to the edge of the cliffs in places, dark green sentinels that had stood watch here long before the lighthouse was built. A family of deer was picking their way along a path near the tree line, pausing occasionally to browse on the new spring growth. North and south, the ocean extended to the horizon, its surface beginning to sparkle as the sun climbed higher. Thomas could see no ships in distress, no signs of weather approaching. It would be a peaceful day, the kind that made his job seem less like work and more like a privilege. Descending the stairs, Thomas's thoughts turned to breakfast. His stomach, reliable as a clock, was beginning to make its morning requests known. In the keeping room, he stirred the coals in the cast-iron stove, adding a few pieces of split wood to bring the fire back to life. The stove, a Glenwood range that was the pride of the keeper's quarters, began to tick and pop as the metal expanded with the heat. While waiting for the stove to heat properly, Thomas stepped outside to the small spring house built into the hillside behind the main quarters. The spring had been one of the deciding factors in placing the lighthouse here. Fresh water was precious on these rocky coasts. The spring house was cool and damp inside, its stone walls covered with a fine film of moisture. On wooden shelves sat crocks of butter, wrapped in damp cheesecloth, a pitcher of milk from yesterday's trip to the Davidsons' farm 2 miles inland, and a basket of eggs from his own small flock of chickens. Gathering what he needed for breakfast, Thomas paused to check on the chickens themselves. The hen house, sturdy built to withstand the coastal storms, was beginning to stir with activity. The rooster, a magnificent Rhode Island red named General Grant, a name that never failed to make Thomas smile, was preparing for his morning announcements. The 6 hens were already scratching in their yard, searching for insects and seeds. Thomas scattered a handful of cracked corn for them, counting heads to make sure none had fallen prey to the foxes or hawks that sometimes troubled his small flock. Back in the kitchen, the stove had heated to the proper temperature. Thomas set the heavy iron skillet on the cooking surface and added a dollop of bacon grease saved from Sunday's breakfast. While it heated, he sliced thick pieces from a loaf of brown bread he'd baked 2 days ago. The bread was slightly stale now, but it would toast up nicely in the bacon grease. The eggs sizzled as they hit the hot pan, their edges immediately beginning to brown and crisp. Thomas had learned to cook by necessity rather than inclination, but over the years he'd developed a competence that served him well. He seasoned the eggs with salt and a grinding of black pepper from the mill, then flipped them with practiced ease. While the eggs finished cooking, he prepared his morning coffee. The beans, purchased on his monthly trip to the village, were ground in a small hand mill that had belonged to his grandmother. The grounds went into the blue enamel coffee pot, followed by cold water from the spring. Set on the back of the stove, it would slowly come to a boil while he ate, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Breakfast was taken at the small table by the east window, where Thomas could watch the sea while he ate. The eggs were perfect, the yolks still soft enough to soak into the fried bread. He ate slowly, savoring the simple meal and the peace of the morning. Through the window, he watched a seal surface near the rocks, its whiskered face curious as it observed the lighthouse before diving again in search of fish. The coffee was ready by the time he finished eating, strong and black the way he'd learned to drink it during the war. Those had been different mornings, drinking chicory coffee from a tin cup while wondering if the day would bring battle. Now, his battles were with rust and weather, his enemies nothing more threatening than the wear of time on his equipment. After washing his dishes in water heated on the stove, Thomas kept a fastidiously clean house. Having learned in the army the importance of cleanliness to health, he prepared for the morning's maintenance tasks. But first, he climbed back up to the lamp room for the morning cleaning of the lens. The Fresnel lens required daily attention to maintain its effectiveness. Any film of salt, soot, or dust could diminish the light's power. Thomas had a special chamois cloth, soft as silk, that he used for nothing else. Starting at the top, he carefully wiped each prism, each bullseye, each prismatic ring. The work was meditative, requiring focus but not thought, and Thomas often found his mind wandering peacefully as his hands performed their familiar task. As he worked, the sun climbed higher, sending shafts of light through the lens that painted spectacular patterns on the lamproom walls. Sometimes Thomas felt as if he were inside a giant jewel, surrounded by fractured rainbows and dancing lights. It was one of the secret beauties of his job, these moments of pure optical magic that no one else saw. The lens cleaning took the better part of an hour. When finished, Thomas checked the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens during operation. The weights needed to be wound back to the top of their travel, ready for tonight's operation. The gears needed a drop or two of oil, not too much, or they would gum up, but just enough to keep them running smoothly. Thomas had learned the exact sound of properly lubricated gears, a soft whisper of metal on metal that told him all was well. With the lens maintained and ready for the evening's lighting, Thomas descended once again to attend to the numerous tasks that filled a lighthouse keeper's day. The sun had fully risen now, its light streaming through the windows and warming the keeper's quarters. The day promised to be fair, with only a few high, wispy clouds sketching delicate patterns across the blue canvas of the sky. In the equipment shed attached to the main building, Thomas surveyed his tools and supplies. Everything had its place on the wooden shelves and pegboard walls: hammers and saws, planes and chisels, paint brushes soaking in turpentine, coils of rope in various thicknesses, brass polish and cleaning cloths, spare lamp wicks carefully wrapped in oiled paper to keep them supple, and dozens of other items essential to maintaining the lighthouse. Today's first task was one he'd been putting off for several days: repairing a section of wooden fence that winter storms had damaged. The fence, which ran along the cliff edge to prevent anyone from accidentally wandering too close to the drop, was essential for safety, especially when fog rolled in and obscured the dangerous edges. Thomas loaded his tools into a wooden carpenter's box: a hammer with a handle worn smooth from use, a small saw, a handful of square-cut nails in a leather pouch, and a folding ruler. He also took several lengths of lumber that he'd salvaged from driftwood and carefully dried and planed smooth. There was something satisfying about taking wood that the sea had cast up and returning it to useful service. The walk to the damaged section of fence was pleasant in the morning sun. The path wound through a patch of wild roses, their buds just beginning to show pink at the tips. Later in the summer, they would fill this area with their sweet fragrance. Beach peas were already flowering, their purple blooms attracting early bees that hummed drowsily from flower to flower. The fence damage was worse than Thomas had initially thought. 3 posts had been loosened by the frost heaves of winter, and 2 crosspieces had split. He set down his tools and stood for a moment, planning the repair. His father had been a carpenter before the war, and had taught Thomas that time spent thinking through a job was never wasted. First, the loose posts needed to be reset. Thomas dug around each one with a small spade, removing the loose soil and stones. The post holes needed to be deeper to get below the frost line. The work was rhythmic and warming: dig, remove a shovelful of earth, dig again. The soil here was thin, barely covering the granite bedrock, but pockets of deeper earth collected in the crevices. As he worked, Thomas became aware of the life around him. A pair of song sparrows had built their nest in a nearby juniper bush, and they watched him with bright, suspicious eyes. He moved slowly and deliberately, trying not to alarm them. A monarch butterfly, early for the season, drifted past on the breeze, its orange and black wings catching the sunlight. With the posts reset and firmly packed with a mixture of earth and small stones, Thomas turned his attention to the split crosspieces. The wood had weathered to a silver gray, and the splits followed the grain in long, splintering tiers. Rather than try to repair them, Thomas decided to replace them entirely with his salvaged driftwood pieces. The old nails came out with difficulty, rusted and bent from their time in the weather. Thomas worked them free carefully with the claw of his hammer, trying not to further damage the posts. Each old nail went into his leather pouch. They could be straightened and reused for less critical tasks. Nothing was wasted at a lighthouse station. The nearest hardware store was a day's journey away. The new crosspieces fit well, and Thomas took pride in the clean, straight lines as he nailed them in place. The hammer blows rang out in the morning air, a rhythmic percussion that seemed to blend with the sound of the waves below. 3 nails per end, driven straight and true, the heads seated just below the surface of the wood to prevent snagging. Standing back to survey his work, Thomas felt the simple satisfaction of a job well done. The fence was sturdy again, ready to withstand whatever weather might come. He ran his hand along the smooth surface of the new wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. In time, it too would weather to match the rest of the fence, becoming part of the landscape. The sun was climbing toward noon now, and Thomas's stomach was beginning to suggest that lunch might be in order. But first, he had one more morning task, checking the oil supplies and preparing the evening's fuel. The oil house was a small stone building set apart from the main structures for safety. Inside, large casks of sperm whale oil lined the walls, their wood dark and oil-stained. Thomas kept careful records of oil consumption, noting in his logbook each night how much was used. The Lighthouse board was particular about such records, requiring monthly reports of all supplies used. He opened the spigot on the current cask and carefully filled the 5-gallon carrier that he would take up to the lamp room before sunset. The oil flowed thick and golden, its distinctive smell filling the small space. Whale oil was becoming more expensive and harder to obtain as the whale fisheries declined, and there was talk of converting to kerosene. But for now, the old ways continued. With the oil measured and ready, Thomas made his way back to the keeper's quarters for lunch. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and he opened the windows to let in the fresh sea breeze. Lunch was a simple affair: cold sliced ham from Sunday's dinner, more of the brown bread with butter and blackberry preserves put up last autumn, and a glass of cool milk from the spring house. He ate while reading a month-old copy of the Portland Daily Press that had come with the last supply boat. The news seemed distant and unimportant here: political arguments in Washington, the latest fashions from Paris, advertisements for patent medicines and miraculous devices. Thomas read it all with mild interest, but his real world was bounded by the reach of his lighthouse beam. After lunch, Thomas allowed himself a brief rest in the rocking chair on the covered porch. This was his one concession to leisure during the working day, a half hour of gentle rocking while he digested his meal and perhaps dozed lightly. The chair had been left by the previous keeper, its runners worn smooth by years of use. Thomas had added a cushion sewn from an old sail, stuffed with dried grass, that made it even more comfortable. The porch faced south, protected from the prevailing winds but open to the warmth of the sun. From here, Thomas could see the small vegetable garden he'd planted in a sheltered spot near the henhouse. The peas were already climbing their stakes, and the potato plants were pushing through the carefully mounded soil. The lettuce and radishes he'd planted early were nearly ready to harvest, promising fresh additions to his meals. As he rocked, Thomas watched the sea birds wheeling over the water. Turns dove-like arrows into the waves, emerging with small silver fish writhing in their beaks. A group of cormorants stood on a rocky outcrop, their wings spread to dry in the sun, looking like ancient hieroglyphs against the sky. Far out to sea, he could see the spout of a whale, probably a finback heading north to summer feeding grounds. The afternoon brought its own set of tasks and rhythms. Thomas rose from his rocking chair refreshed, ready for the second half of his working day. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon, though sunset was still many hours away. His first afternoon task was one of the most important, polishing the brass fittings throughout the lighthouse. The lighthouse board inspectors, who arrived unannounced several times a year, were particularly keen on the state of the brass. A lighthouse keeper is judged by his brass, the inspector had told Thomas during his first review, and Thomas had taken the words to heart. He gathered his polishing supplies, soft cotton cloths, worn thin from use and washing, a tin of brass polish made from rotten stone and whale oil, and a chamois for the final buffing. Starting in the lamp room, he worked on the brass framework that held the lamp mechanism. The metal was already fairly bright, Thomas never let it get truly tarnished, but regular polishing was necessary to combat the salt air that could corrode even the finest brass. The work was methodical and soothing. Apply a small amount of polish with one cloth, work it in circular motions until the tarnish lifted, then buff with a clean cloth until the brass gleamed like gold. The lamp room had dozens of brass fittings, hinges, latches, ventilator controls, oil valves, and decorative elements. Each received the same careful attention. As he worked, Thomas could feel the tower swaying slightly in the breeze. It was an almost imperceptible movement, just enough to remind him that he was high above the ground in a structure designed to flex rather than resist the wind. The sensation had been unsettling at first, but now he found it oddly comforting, like being rocked in a giant cradle. Moving down through the lighthouse, he polished the brass handrails on the spiral staircase, working from top to bottom so any drips of polish would fall on unpolished sections. The handrail was worn smooth in places from the countless hands that had gripped it over the years. Thomas wondered sometimes about the other keepers who had climbed these stairs, tended this light. What had their lives been like? What had brought them to this solitary posting? In the watch room, one level below the lamp room, more brass awaited, the fittings on the windows, the oil vapor vents, the speaking tube that connected to the quarters below, though Thomas, living alone, had no use for it. This room served as a staging area for supplies and a shelter during storms when the lamp room became too turbulent to occupy safely. Here Thomas kept his storm supplies, extra wicks, matches and waterproof containers, emergency oil, blankets, and a small supply of hardtack and water. During the worst storms of winter, when the tower shook and the wind howled like all the demons of the deep, a keeper might need to stay in the tower for hours or even days, unable to safely descend to the quarters below. The brass polishing took most of 2 hours. When finished, Thomas stood back to admire his work. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows struck the polished metal, filling the tower with warm golden reflections. It was like being inside a lighthouse-sized lamp chimney, all gleam and glow. Next came the task of washing the tower windows, both inside and out. The exterior washing was the more challenging job, requiring Thomas to lean out through the open windows with a long-handled brush and squeegee. The salt spray from the ocean left a constant film on the glass that had to be removed regularly or it would etch the surface permanently. He mixed his washing solution in a bucket, water with a splash of vinegar and a few drops of whale oil soap. The vinegar cut through the salt deposits, while the soap helped the solution sheet off the glass without streaking. Starting at the top of the tower and working down, Thomas washed each window with careful attention. The exterior washing required some acrobatic maneuvering. Thomas had to brace himself carefully in the window opening, one hand gripping the frame while the other wielded the brush. The ground seemed very far below, and the rocks at the base of the lighthouse looked particularly uninviting. But Thomas had no fear of heights, couldn't afford to have such fears in this profession. As he worked, a seal popped its head up in the waters below, watching him with what seemed like amused curiosity. Thomas had named this one Whiskers for the particularly prominent set of bristles around his nose. Whiskers was a regular visitor, often appearing during Thomas's outdoor work as if to supervise. "Afternoon, Whiskers," Thomas called down, his voice carried away by the wind. The seal continued to watch for a moment, then disappeared beneath the waves with barely a ripple. The window washing complete, Thomas descended to ground level for his next task, tending the vegetable garden. This was perhaps his favorite part of the day, working with the soil and growing things. The garden was small but productive, supplementing his diet with fresh vegetables during the growing season and preserved foods for winter. He filled a watering can from the rain barrel position to catch runoff from the keeper's quarters roof. The water was sun-warmed and soft, perfect for the tender plants. Thomas moved slowly among the rows, giving each plant its share of water, checking for insect damage or signs of disease. The tomato plants he'd started from seed indoors were now transplanted and beginning to establish themselves. He tied them gently to their stakes with strips of soft cloth, guiding their growth upward. The bean plants were beginning to flower, tiny white blossoms that would become green beans in a few weeks. The squash plants were spreading their broad leaves, and Thomas could see the beginning of what would become summer squashes and pumpkins for autumn. Weeding came next, kneeling between the rows to pull the persistent chickweed and lamb's quarters that seemed to spring up overnight. Thomas didn't mind the weeding. There was something satisfying about clearing the soil around his vegetables, giving them room to grow. The pulled weeds went into a pile for the compost heap, nothing wasted. As he worked, Thomas noticed a hummingbird visiting the scarlet runner beans he'd planted along the garden fence. The tiny bird hovered at each red flower, its wings a blur, its iridescent throat catching the sun. Such a small creature to make such long journeys, migrating from Central America to these northern shores. Thomas remained still, not wanting to disturb the bird's feeding. The garden work was peaceful, the kind of labor that cleared the mind and settled the spirit. The soil under his fingers was warming in the spring sun, rich and dark from years of composting and care. Thomas could feel the life in it, the promise of growth and harvest. With the garden tended, Thomas walked down to the small wharf where supplies were landed. The wharf needed constant maintenance to combat the effects of salt water and weather. Today, he was checking the pilings for damage from shipworms and replacing several planks that had begun to rot. The tide was low, exposing the barnacle-covered portions of the pilings that were usually underwater. Thomas climbed down the ladder to inspect them closely. The creosote treatment seemed to be holding up well, the black, tar-like substance protecting the wood from the worst of the marine borers. Still, he made notes in his small pocket notebook about areas that would need attention before winter. Back on the wharf proper, he pried up the rotted planks with a crowbar, careful not to damage the supporting joists beneath. The old wood was soft and punky, breaking apart in his hands. Underneath, small crabs scuttled for cover, and a family of barnacles clicked and whispered in their shells. The replacement planks had been cut to size during the winter and treated with linseed oil to protect them from the elements. Thomas fitted each one carefully, making sure the edges aligned properly. The new nails went in straight and true, their galvanized coating bright against the weathered wood. As he worked, a lobster boat chugged by, heading back to port with the day's catch. The captain, recognizing the lighthouse keeper, raised his hand in greeting, and Thomas waved back. It was one of the few human interactions he might have in a day, these distant acknowledgments between maritime workers. The wharf repairs complete, Thomas climbed back up the path to the lighthouse. The afternoon was advancing, and soon it would be time to prepare for the evening's lighting. But first, there was time for a cup of tea and a brief rest. In the kitchen, Thomas put the kettle on the stove and prepared his tea things. The tea was a luxury, purchased from a merchant in Portland who imported it from China. Thomas allowed himself 1 cup each afternoon, savoring both the taste and the ritual of its preparation. While the water heated, he set out his tea service, a blue and white china cup and saucer that had belonged to his mother, a small pewter spoon, and a honey pot filled with honey from a wild bee tree he'd found the previous autumn. The tea itself was kept in a small tin caddy, decorated with scenes of Chinese gardens and pagodas. When the kettle sang, Thomas poured the boiling water over the tea leaves in his small ceramic pot, another inheritance from his mother. The aroma filled the kitchen, earthy, slightly smoky, with hints of flowers in distant places. He let it steep for exactly 4 minutes. He'd found this to be the perfect time for this particular tea. Carrying his cup and saucer, Thomas went to sit in the parlor, the most formal room in the keeper's quarters. It was simply furnished but comfortable, 2 upholstered chairs, a small sofa, a bookshelf, and a writing desk where he kept the lighthouse logs and records. The walls were decorated with a few pictures, a painting of a sailing ship that had come with the quarters, a framed map of the Maine coast, and a photograph of Thomas's family taken before the war. He sat in his favorite chair by the window, where he could watch the sea while he drank his tea. The honey sweetened it just enough, and the warmth spread through him pleasantly. This was his thinking time, when he might plan future projects, compose letters in his mind to family and friends, or simply let his thoughts drift like the clouds outside. Today, he was thinking about a letter from his sister that had arrived with the last mail delivery. She was worried about him, alone out here on the coast. She wanted him to come back to Boston, find work in the city, perhaps find a wife and start a family. Thomas understood her concern, but how could he explain the peace he'd found here? How could he describe the satisfaction of keeping the light burning, of being a guardian for those at sea? As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in subtle shades of gold and orange, Thomas set aside his teacup and prepared for the most important part of his day, lighting the beacon that would guide ships through the night. The ritual began with checking the weather. Thomas stepped outside and stood for a moment, reading the signs that years of experience had taught him to recognize. The wind had shifted slightly to the southwest, often a sign of approaching weather, but the barometer in the hallway was holding steady. The clouds on the horizon were high and thin, no threat for tonight. It would be a clear evening with good visibility. He climbed to the lamp room one more time before the official lighting, carrying the 5-gallon can of whale oil he'd prepared earlier. The lamp's reservoir needed to be filled to exactly the right level, too full and it might overflow when heated, too low and it might run dry during the night. Thomas had a mark scratched on the inside of the reservoir that showed the proper level, and he filled to it precisely. Next, he trimmed the wicks. This was perhaps the most crucial task in maintaining a proper light. Each of the 5 concentric wicks had to be trimmed to exactly the right height and shape. Too high and they would smoke, clouding the lens. Too low and the light would be dim. The edges had to be perfectly even, or the flame would be irregular. Thomas used special scissors designed for the purpose, with curved blades that matched the circular shape of the wicks. He trimmed each wick carefully, catching the trimmed pieces in a small pan. The charred edges crumbled at his touch, leaving fresh, clean cotton ready to draw up the oil and burn brightly. With the mechanical preparations complete, Thomas wound the clockwork mechanism that would rotate the lens through the night. The weights rose slowly up their track as he turned the crank, click by click, until they reached the top. Once released, they would descend gradually over 12 hours, turning the gears that rotated the lens and creating the lighthouse's characteristic flash pattern, 2 white flashes followed by a red, the signature of Seal Point light. The sun was now touching the horizon, painting the sea in brilliant oranges and reds. It was time. Thomas lit a long taper from the small alcohol lamp he kept burning in the lamp room for this purpose. Starting with the center wick, he carefully lit each one in sequence, adjusting the height as the flames took hold. The whale oil burned with a clear, bright flame, nearly smokeless when properly trimmed. As the flames grew and merged into a single brilliant light, the Fresnel lens began its magic. The light that would have dispersed in all directions was gathered, focused, and sent out in a powerful beam that would be visible for 15 miles on a clear night. Thomas watched as the clockwork engaged and the lens began its slow rotation, sending the beam sweeping across the darkening sea. The lamp room filled with warmth and light. Thomas made final adjustments to the wick heights, ensuring that each burned evenly. He checked the oil feed valves, making sure the flow was steady but not excessive. Everything had to be perfect. Ships depended on this light. Satisfied that all was well, Thomas descended to the watchroom to make his evening log entry. In the large leather-bound logbook, he wrote in his careful hand, May 15, 1873. Evening lighting at 7:47 p.m. Weather clear, wind SW at 5 knots. Barometer holding at 30.12. Sea state calm to moderate. Oil consumption normal. All equipment functioning properly. T. Whitfield, keeper. With the light lit and the log entry made, Thomas could turn his attention to his evening meal. The keeper's quarters were beginning to fill with long shadows as the sun disappeared below the horizon. He lit the oil lamps in the kitchen and parlor, their softer light creating pools of warmth in the gathering darkness. Dinner was often the most substantial meal of Thomas's day. Tonight, he had a piece of salt cod that had been soaking since morning to remove the excess salt. He floured it lightly and fried it in butter until the edges were crispy and golden. Alongside, He boiled some of the small new potatoes from his garden, their skins so tender they barely needed scraping. A mess of dandelion greens, picked from the meadow and wilted with a bit of bacon fat and vinegar, completed the meal. He ate at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around him. Through the window, he could see the lighthouse beam sweeping across the landscape, illuminating the rocks and waves in brief, brilliant moments before moving on. It was hypnotic, this regular sweep of light, like a giant clock marking time through the darkness. After dinner, Thomas washed his dishes and put them away, maintaining the orderly routine that structured his days. The evening was still young, and he had several hours before his midnight check of the light. This was his time for personal pursuits, reading, writing letters, or working on small projects. Tonight, he decided to work on a ship model he'd been building during the winter months. It was a model of a fishing schooner, the type that worked these waters, carved from a piece of pine he'd found washed up on the beach. Thomas had been a decent whittler before the war, and the long, quiet evenings at the lighthouse had given him time to refine his skills. He brought the model and his tools to the parlor, spreading an old cloth on the table to catch the shavings. The model was about 18 inches long, and Thomas was currently working on the delicate rigging. Using thread waxed with beeswax, he carefully strung the miniature stays and shrouds, tying knots so small he needed a magnifying glass to see them properly. The work required patience and a steady hand. Each line had to be the right tension, neither too loose nor so tight it would bend the delicate masts. Thomas worked slowly, methodically, finding a meditative peace in the precise movements. The only sounds were the tick of the mantel clock, the distant crash of waves, and the occasional cry of a night bird. As he worked, memories sometimes surfaced unbidden. The war had been over for 8 years, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. The noise and chaos of battle, the fear and adrenaline, the friends lost, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. But here, in the quiet of the lighthouse, with his hands busy with peaceful work, the memories had less power to disturb. By 10 o'clock, Thomas had completed the main rigging on his model. He cleaned up his work area, carefully putting away his tools and the unfinished model. It was time for his evening rounds, checking that all was secure before the midnight inspection of the light. He started outside, walking the perimeter of the lighthouse property with a lantern. The night was clear and cool, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The Milky Way was just becoming visible, a river of light across the heavens. Thomas paused to look up, remembering the nights during the war when he'd slept under these same stars, wondering if he'd live to see another sunset. He checked the oil house, ensuring it was locked and secure. The hen house was quiet, the chickens roosting for the night. He could hear the soft clucking and rustling as they settled on their perches. The garden gate was latched against any deer that might come looking for an easy meal. Down at the wharf, the tide had come in, and waves lapped gently against the pilings. A night heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting for unwary fish. It regarded Thomas with one yellow eye but didn't flee, apparently deciding he was no threat. Back inside, Thomas made a cup of warm milk with a touch of honey, a nighttime ritual that helped him sleep. He sat in the parlor, reading from his volume of Wordsworth by lamplight. The poetry, with its celebration of nature and solitude, seemed particularly appropriate to his current life. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er valleys and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd. A host of golden daffodils. The words washed over him like a gentle tide, peaceful and rhythmic. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its endless rotation, a guardian angel watching over the dark sea. At 11:30, Thomas set aside his book and prepared for the midnight inspection of the light. This was one of 4 required checks during the night: midnight, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and the dawn extinguishing. Many keepers found the interrupted sleep difficult, but Thomas had adapted to the rhythm, often waking moments before his alarm clock rang. He climbed the tower stairs once more, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls. The lamp room was warm and bright, the whale oil burning steadily. Thomas checked each wick, making small adjustments where needed. A tiny amount of carbon had built up on one edge, and he carefully scraped it away with a special tool. The oil level was good, the clockwork mechanism turning smoothly. Standing in the lamp room at midnight was a unique experience. The world outside was vast and dark, with only the occasional light of a ship visible in the distance. The beam swept around and around, briefly illuminating patches of sea that gleamed like hammered silver before falling back into darkness. It was both lonely and magnificent, being the keeper of this light in the vast darkness. Thomas could see a ship's lights to the south, probably a coastal freighter heading for Portland. He watched as it adjusted its course slightly, using his lighthouse as a navigation aid. This was why he was here, this was his purpose, to be the steady point of reference in the darkness, the guide that brought sailors safely home. The midnight check complete, Thomas descended to his bedroom. He had trained himself to fall asleep quickly between checks, a necessity of the keeper's life. He removed his boots and outer clothes but kept his underwear and socks on. There might be an emergency that required quick response. His bed was narrow but comfortable, with a thick feather mattress and warm wool blankets. Thomas had added a quilt his sister had made, a pattern called ocean waves that seemed appropriate for a lighthouse keeper. He pulled the covers up to his chin and closed his eyes, letting the sound of the actual ocean waves lull him towards sleep. Sleep came quickly, the deep, dreamless sleep of physical tiredness and mental peace. It seemed only moments before the alarm clock was ringing for the 2 o'clock check. Thomas rose immediately, habit overcoming the desire to stay in the warm bed. He pulled on his trousers and shirt, slipped his feet into his boots, and headed up the tower once more. The 2 o'clock check was usually the quickest. The light had been burning for several hours and had settled into a steady rhythm. Thomas made minor adjustments to the wicks, checked the oil flow, and wound the clockwork mechanism a quarter turn to ensure it wouldn't run down before morning. The night was still clear, though clouds were beginning to gather on the western horizon. Back to bed for another period of sleep. This time Thomas dreamed, though he wouldn't remember the details in the morning. Something about sailing on a calm sea, the lighthouse always visible on the horizon, a constant point of reference in a changing world. The 4 o'clock check came with the first hints of the approaching dawn. The eastern sky was still dark, but there was a subtle change in the quality of the darkness, a softening that suggested the sun's approach. Thomas performed his inspection routine, noting that the oil consumption had been exactly as expected. The wicks would need thorough trimming in the morning, but they would last until dawn. This time, Thomas didn't return to bed. Dawn was only an hour or so away, and he'd learned it was better to stay up than try to grab a few more minutes of sleep. Instead, he made coffee and sat in the kitchen, watching through the window as the sky gradually lightened. The birds began their dawn chorus while the stars were still visible. First the robins, their cheerful song rising from the bushes near the house. Then the song sparrows, the chickadees, the gulls beginning their daily patrol of the shoreline. By the time the sky had turned from black to deep blue to gray, the air was filled with birdsong. Thomas carried his coffee up to the lamp room for the dawn extinguishing. This was always a poignant moment, the ending of the night's vigil. As the sun broke the horizon, painting the sea in shades of rose and gold, Thomas carefully lowered each wick in sequence, watching as the flames died down and finally went out. The great lens went dark, its job done for another night. He covered the lens with its curtain, protecting it from the sun's rays that were now streaming through the windows. The lamp room, which had been warm all night, began to cool. Thomas opened the ventilators to air it out, then stood for a moment on the gallery, watching the new day begin. A fishing fleet was heading out, their sails catching the morning breeze. He could see smoke rising from chimneys in the distant village as people began their day. A train whistle echoed faintly across the water, the morning freight heading north to Bangor. The world was waking up, beginning another day of industry and purpose. As spring advanced toward summer, Thomas's days fell into a comfortable rhythm, each one similar to the last but never quite the same. The subtle changes in weather, the progression of his garden, the occasional visitors, and the constant presence of the sea ensured that no 2 days were identical. On this particular morning in late May, Thomas woke to the sound of rain pattering against his window. Not a storm, just a gentle spring rain that would water his garden and wash the salt from the lighthouse windows. He rose at his usual time, but the gray light filtering through the clouds made it feel earlier. The lamp room was shrouded in mist when he climbed the tower to extinguish the light. Visibility was reduced to perhaps a quarter mile, the sea and sky blending into a uniform gray. The lighthouse beam had been especially important on a night like this, when ships couldn't navigate by stars or coastal landmarks. After extinguishing the light and performing his morning maintenance, Thomas returned to the quarters for breakfast. The rain had intensified slightly, drumming steadily on the roof. It was a pleasant sound, creating a sense of coziness inside the sturdy building. Breakfast on a rainy day called for something more substantial than usual. Thomas mixed up a batch of pancake batter using flour, eggs from his hens, milk, and a touch of molasses for sweetness. He cooked them on the griddle, watching as bubbles formed and popped on the surface before flipping them to brown the other side. With butter and maple syrup purchased from a farmer inland, they made a fine meal. The rain continued through the morning, preventing most outdoor work. Thomas took advantage of the weather to catch up on his correspondence. He had letters to write to his sister, to an old army friend who now lived in Ohio, and to the Lighthouse board with his monthly report. He set up his writing materials at the desk in the parlor, good paper, his steel-nibbed pen, a bottle of ink, and blotting paper. Letter writing was an art that required thought and care. Once words were committed to paper and sent, they couldn't be taken back. To his sister, he wrote of the arrival of spring, the progress of his garden, the peace he continued to find in his solitary life. He tried to reassure her that he was not lonely but rather contentedly alone. He described the migrating birds he'd seen, the whales passing by, the satisfaction of maintaining the lighthouse in perfect condition. "Dear Martha," he wrote, "you ask if I am lonely here, and I understand your concern. But I must tell you that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. I have the company of the sea, the birds, the occasional seal who seems to have appointed himself my supervisor. I have my books, my work, my thoughts. The days are full, the nights have purpose. I am more at peace here than I have been since before the war." To his army friend, James Patterson, he wrote of different things. James would understand the need for peace after chaos, the appeal of routine after years of uncertainty. They had served together in the 20th Maine, had stood together at Gettysburg, had survived when so many hadn't. "Jim," he wrote, "you asked in your last letter if I ever missed the excitement of those days. I can honestly say I do not. I had enough excitement to last several lifetimes. Now I find satisfaction in smaller things, a well-trimmed wick, a freshly painted fence, vegetables growing in good soil. These things may seem mundane to some, but to me they represent the life we fought to preserve." The official report to the Lighthouse Board was more formal, filled with specific details about oil consumption, equipment maintenance, and ships sighted. Thomas kept careful records in his daily log, and transferring these to the monthly report was mostly a matter of compilation and summary. By noon, the rain had tapered to a light drizzle. Thomas put on his oilskin coat and went out to check on his chickens. They were huddled in their coop, looking decidedly unhappy about the weather. He scattered some corn for them and collected the eggs, only 3 today, as the hens were less productive in damp weather. The garden was thriving in the rain. The pea plants were covered in white flowers, and the first pods were beginning to form. The lettuce was ready for harvesting, and Thomas cut several heads for the coming day's meals. The rain had beaten down some of the taller plants, and he made a mental note to stake them when the weather cleared. After lunch, a simple meal of bread and cheese with some of the fresh lettuce, Thomas decided to use the afternoon to reorganize the supply room. This was where he kept the lighthouse's spare parts and maintenance supplies, and it had become somewhat disordered over the winter months. He started by taking everything out, laying items on the floor of the adjacent room. Spare lamp chimneys wrapped in paper and packed in straw, extra wicks in their sealed containers, brass polish, paint, brushes, tools, rope, canvas for repairs, medical supplies for emergencies, the accumulation of materials necessary to keep the lighthouse running independently for months if necessary. As he worked, Thomas found items he'd forgotten he had: a set of brass hinges that would be perfect for repairing the oilhouse door, a coil of manila rope that could replace the worn line on the flagpole, a tin of special grease for the clockwork mechanism that he'd been meaning to try. He cleaned the shelves thoroughly before replacing items in logical order. Lamp supplies on one shelf, tools on another, paint and maintenance materials on a third. Everything labeled and easy to find. It was satisfying work, bringing order from chaos, making the space more efficient. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped and the sun was trying to break through the clouds. Thomas went outside to find the world washed clean and sparkling. Every leaf held droplets of water that caught the light like tiny prisms. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things. He walked down to the shore, where the rain had left patterns in the sand and the rocks glistened wetly. The tide was going out, exposing the intertidal zone with its fascinating array of life. Barnacles clicked and whispered, filtering the water for food. Periwinkles made their slow progress across the rocks. In a tide pool, Thomas spotted a small crab, no bigger than his thumbnail, scuttling sideways beneath a front of seaweed. The evening lighting routine proceeded as always. though the lens needed extra cleaning due to the moisture in the air. As Thomas lit the wicks, he noticed that the clouds were breaking up, revealing patches of deep blue sky. It would be a partly cloudy night, the beam sometimes sharp and clear, sometimes diffused by passing clouds. Dinner was special tonight, fresh peas from the garden, the first of the season, sweet and tender. He cooked them simply, with a bit of butter and a sprig of mint that grew wild near the spring house. Along with a piece of fried ham and new potatoes, it was a feast of early summer freshness. After dinner, Thomas sat on the porch despite the dampness, watching the play of clouds across the moon. The lighthouse beam swept through patches of mist, creating ethereal effects as it illuminated the water droplets in the air. Sometimes the beam seemed solid, like a giant finger pointing out to sea. Other times it dissolved into a soft glow that lit the clouds from within. As the evening progressed into night, Thomas prepared for his regular rounds of checking the light. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with the electricity that remained in the air after the rain. The barometer was rising, suggesting good weather ahead, but there was an unsettled quality to the atmosphere that made Thomas extra vigilant. He decided to spend more time than usual in the watchroom, the level just below the lamp room. Here he kept a comfortable chair and a small table where he could work on projects while staying close to the light. Tonight, he brought up his logbook to write a more detailed entry than usual, inspired perhaps by the letter writing of the morning. May 28, 1873, he began. The spring rain today has brought out the green in everything. Looking from the tower, the landscape appears to have been painted fresh, every color more vivid than before. The garden is thriving beyond my expectations. If this weather continues, I shall have vegetables to share with the Davidsons when next I visit for milk. The light burns steady tonight, though clouds pass occasionally across the beam. I can see two ships' lights to the southeast, keeping well clear of Seal Point rocks thanks to our beacon. It strikes me often how many souls depend on this light without ever knowing the name of the keeper who tends it. There is something profound in this anonymous service. He paused in his writing to check the lamp, climbing the short flight of stairs to the lamp room. All was well, the wicks burning evenly, the clockwork turning smoothly. Through the lens, he could see the distorted image of the world outside, bent and refracted into strange patterns. It was like looking through a giant's jeweled eye. Returning to his writing, Thomas continued. I have been thinking lately of permanence and change. This lighthouse has stood for 23 years, and will likely stand for many more after I am gone. Yet each day brings small changes, erosion of the rocks, growth of the plants, the endless reshaping of the shoreline by the sea. We keepers are temporary guardians of something meant to outlast us. The war taught me that life is fragile and precious. Every day since then has been a gift I didn't expect to receive. Perhaps that's why I find such satisfaction in this simple life. Each morning I wake is a morning many of my comrades didn't see. Each light I kindle is a small victory against the darkness. The midnight check approached, and Thomas set aside his writing. The lamp room was warm and close, the whale oil burning with its distinctive smell. He trimmed a wick that had developed an uneven edge, watching as the flame steadied and brightened. The lens turned on its axis, sending the beam around and around in its endless circle. Outside, the clouds had mostly cleared, revealing a canopy of stars. Thomas could see the constellation Cassiopeia, the queen sitting on her throne. The Big Dipper pointed to Polaris, the North Star, the one fixed point in the rotating heavens. Sailors had navigated by these stars for thousands of years, and even in this age of modern charts and compasses, the stars remained the ultimate reference. After the midnight check, Thomas didn't immediately return to bed. Instead, he stood on the gallery outside the lamp room, breathing the cool night air. The sea was phosphorescent tonight, glowing faintly where the waves broke against the rocks. It was caused by tiny organisms in the water, he'd been told, though it looked like magic, the sea lit from within by cold fire. An owl called from the woods, probably the great horned owl that nested in the tall pine near the spring house. Its deep hooting carried clearly in the still air. Another owl answered from farther away, and for a few minutes they carried on their nocturnal conversation. Thomas finally descended to his quarters, but sleep eluded him. His mind was too active, thoughts flowing like the tide. He made himself a cup of chamomile tea, hoping it would calm his restless energy. Sitting in the kitchen with just a single candle for light, he listened to the sounds of the night. The house itself was never truly quiet. Wood beams creaked as they cooled from the day's warmth. The clock in the parlor ticked steadily. Wind whispered under the eaves and around the windows. These were the sounds of home, as familiar now as his own heartbeat. At 2 o'clock, he made his scheduled check of the light. This time he noticed that one of the oil feed valves was slightly out of adjustment, allowing too much oil to flow to one wick. It was a minor issue, but left uncorrected it could cause that wick to smoke. Thomas made the adjustment, a quarter turn of the brass valve, and watched as the flames settled to the proper height. The eastern sky was still fully dark when he made the 4 o'clock check. Venus was rising as the morning star, brilliant in the pre-dawn sky. Soon it would fade as the sun approached, but for now it was the brightest object besides the moon. Thomas decided to stay in the lamp room for the dawn, watching as the sky gradually lightened. First came a barely perceptible graying of the darkness, so subtle he wasn't sure if he was seeing it or imagining it. Then the eastern horizon began to show a line of differentiation between sea and sky. The stars began to fade, starting with the dimmest and working up to the brightest. The birds began their dawn chorus while it was still quite dark. First a single robin, as if testing whether it was really time to sing. Then others joined in, until the air was filled with their music. Thomas could identify many of the songs now, the complex melody of the song sparrow, the cheerful whistle of the cardinal, the harsh cry of the jay. As the sun approached the horizon, the sky began its daily transformation. Deep purple gave way to lighter violet, then to pink and orange. Clouds that had been invisible in the darkness suddenly appeared, their undersides painted gold and crimson. The sea changed from black to deep blue to gray-green. And then the sun itself appeared, first a sliver of brilliant light on the horizon, then rising rapidly into a full disk. The lighthouse beam, which had been so vital and bright in the darkness, suddenly seemed pale and unnecessary. Thomas extinguished the light with his usual careful routine, but this morning he felt more aware of the symbolism, darkness giving way to light, the endless cycle of day and night. June arrived with a burst of warmth and growth. Thomas's garden was now in full production, providing fresh vegetables daily. The peas were at their peak, sweet and tender. The bean plants were covered with flowers in young pods. The tomatoes were setting fruit, still green but full of promise. On this particular June morning, Thomas woke to find a thick fog had rolled in during the night. The lighthouse beam would have been especially important in such conditions, and he was glad he'd given the light extra attention during his checks. The fog muffled all sounds, creating an eerie quiet. Even the waves seemed subdued, their crash against the rocks softened to a whisper. When Thomas stepped outside, he could barely see the oil house 20 feet away. The fog was so thick it seemed to have weight, pressing against him with damp fingers. After extinguishing the light and performing his morning maintenance, Thomas decided to use the foggy morning to work on indoor projects. He had been meaning to repair a chair with a loose leg, and the fog provided the perfect excuse to tackle the job. He carried the chair to the kitchen where the light was best, even on this gray morning. The problem was a loose mortise and tenon joint where the leg met the seat. Over time, the wood had dried and shrunk, creating play in the joint. Thomas had seen his father repair many such chairs in his carpentry shop. First, he carefully disassembled the joint, tapping it apart with a wooden mallet. The old glue had crystallized and lost its holding power. Thomas scraped away the residue with a chisel, working carefully not to damage the wood. Then he cut thin wooden shims from a piece of pine, fitting them precisely to tighten the joint. He mixed fresh hide glue in a small pot on the stove, the pungent smell filling the kitchen. The glue had to be just the right consistency. Too thick and it wouldn't penetrate the wood fibers, too thin and it wouldn't hold. When it was ready, he brushed it onto both parts of the joint, fitted them together with the shims, and clamped the assembly with a wooden screw clamp. While the glue dried, Thomas turned his attention to another indoor task, organizing his seed collection for next year's garden. He had been saving seeds from his best plants, drying them carefully and storing them in small envelopes made from folded paper. He spread the envelopes on the kitchen table, each labeled with the plant variety and date collected. Tomato seeds from the plant that had produced earliest. Bean seeds from the most productive plants. Lettuce seeds from the plants that had been slowest to bolt in the heat. This was selection in its most basic form, gradually improving his garden by saving the best for replanting. By noon, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the world in stages. First, the top of the lighthouse tower became visible, floating disconnected above the fog. Then the building emerged, then the nearby rocks and trees. Finally, the sea appeared, still calm and gray under the overcast sky. Thomas ate his lunch, fresh pea soup made with ham stock, thick with vegetables from the garden, while watching the fog continue to retreat. It clung to the hollows and valleys, creating a landscape of islands floating in a white sea. Beautiful and mysterious, it reminded him of Chinese paintings he'd seen in a book. The afternoon brought a special occasion, the supply boat from Portland. Thomas had seen it approaching through the dissipating fog, its steam whistle announcing its arrival. The boat came monthly during the summer, bringing mail, newspapers, and supplies that couldn't be obtained locally. Thomas walked down to the wharf to meet the boat. Captain Morrison, who'd been running supplies to lighthouses for 15 years, was at the helm. He was a cheerful man with a gray beard and a seemingly endless supply of stories and gossip from the other lighthouse stations. "Morning, Thomas," the captain called as the boat pulled alongside the wharf. "Though I suppose it's afternoon now." That fog was thick as pea soup coming up the coast. "Good thing your light was burning bright last night." The crew unloaded Thomas's supplies, a barrel of flour, a cask of whale oil, 2 gallons of kerosene for the household lamps, a box of various hardware and maintenance supplies, and a package from his sister that felt suspiciously like books. "Any news from the world?" Thomas asked as he signed the receipt for the supplies. "Oh, the usual," Captain Morrison replied. "Politics in Washington, some new invention called a typewriter that's supposed to replace pen and ink, though I'll believe that when I see it. The Weatherbees down at Sequin Light had a baby girl last month. Old Sam at Halfway Rock is retiring. They're looking for a replacement if you know anyone fool enough to want that posting." Halfway Rock was one of the most isolated and difficult stations on the coast, surrounded by rough seas and accessible only in the calmest weather. Thomas didn't envy whoever took that position. After the supply boat departed, Thomas spent the rest of the afternoon moving the supplies to their proper storage places. The flour went into a tin-lined bin in the pantry, safe from mice and moisture. The whale oil was carefully transferred to the storage casks in the oil house. The kerosene was placed on a high shelf, away from any heat sources. The package from his sister contained 3 books, a new novel by Mark Twain, a collection of Emerson's essays, and surprisingly, a cookbook called The American Housewife's Guide to Economical Cooking. The last came with a note: "Even lighthouse keepers need to eat properly. Some of these recipes require only 1 pot and simple ingredients. Please try to eat more than just fish and beans. Your loving sister, Martha." Thomas smiled at her concern. His diet was actually quite varied, especially now with the garden producing, but he appreciated the thought. He paged through the cookbook, finding several recipes that looked both practical and appetizing. Evening came with clearing skies and a fresh breeze from the northwest. The lighthouse beam would shine far tonight over calm seas. As Thomas lit the wicks, he thought about all the ships that would see this light, all the sailors who would use it to confirm their position, all the lives that depended on this simple act of lighting a lamp. Dinner was inspired by one of the cookbook's recipes, a simple fish chowder using fresh cod he'd caught that morning from the rocks, potatoes and onions from the garden, and milk from the Davidsons' farm. The cookbook suggested adding a bit of salt pork for flavor, which Thomas had in his stores. The result was rich and satisfying, better than his usual plain fried fish. After dinner, Thomas sat in the parlor reading the new Mark Twain book by lamplight. The author's humor was sharp but not unkind, finding absurdity in the pretensions of modern life. Thomas found himself chuckling at several passages, the sounds strange in the usually quiet house. The midnight check of the light came all too soon. Thomas climbed the tower, his legs knowing every step, his hand finding the rail automatically. The lamp room was its usual warm sanctuary, the light burning steadily. He made his adjustments and wound the clockwork, then stood for a moment looking out at the peaceful night. A ship was passing to the north, its lights clear in the darkness. Thomas wondered about the people aboard, where they were going, what cargo they carried, what stories they could tell. Ships were like moving cities, each with its own small society, its own rules and rhythms. And all of them, on nights like this, depending on lighthouses to guide them safely through the darkness. July brought the full heat of summer to the coast. Even here, where sea breezes usually kept temperatures moderate, the days grew warm and languid. Thomas adjusted his routine to the season, rising earlier to accomplish outdoor work before the heat of midday, taking a longer rest in the afternoon, and enjoying the cooler evening hours. On this particular July morning, Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of whales passing close to shore. Their deep breathing and occasional splash told him they were feeding, probably on the schools of small fish that came inshore at this time of year. He dressed quickly and climbed the tower, hoping to see them in the pre-dawn light. From the gallery, he could make out several dark shapes in the water, their backs breaking the surface as they breathed. The spray from their blowholes caught the first light of dawn, creating brief rainbows. They were finback whales, he thought, though it was hard to be certain in the dim light. After extinguishing the beacon and completing his morning tasks, Thomas decided to spend the morning fishing from the rocks. The same schools of fish that attracted the whales would make for good fishing, and fresh fish would be a welcome addition to his diet. He gathered his fishing gear, a long bamboo pole, hooks and line, a bucket for bait, and a canvas bag for his catch. For bait, he dug clams from a small beach at low tide, their location betrayed by tiny holes in the sand where they filtered water. The fishing spot was a flat rock that jutted into deeper water, accessible by a narrow path carved by years of use. Thomas had improved the path with steps cut into the steeper sections and a rope handrail in one particularly treacherous spot. The morning was perfect for fishing, calm seas, overcast sky, and a slight current that would carry his bait to the fish. Thomas baited his hook with a piece of clam and cast out, the lead weight carrying the line far from shore. Then he settled into wait, the most important part of fishing. Fishing required patience but not necessarily attention. Thomas's mind could wander while his hands remained alert to any tug on the line. He thought about the letter he would write to his sister, the repairs needed on the chicken coop, the book he was reading. The first bite came within minutes, a sharp tug that bent the rod tip. Thomas set the hook with a practiced motion and began bringing in the fish. It fought well, making several runs that took line, but eventually he brought it to the rocks, a nice cod, perhaps 3 pounds, perfect for several meals. He caught 4 more fish over the next hour, all good eating size. One he would have for dinner tonight, the others he would salt and dry for later use. Salt fish was a staple food along the coast, able to keep for months if properly prepared. Back at the keeper's quarters, Thomas cleaned the fish at the outdoor cleaning station he'd built, a simple table with a drain that carried the waste away from the house. The gulls gathered immediately, hoping for scraps. Thomas obliged them with the heads and entrails, watching as they squabbled over the treats. The fish fillets went into a salt brine for the first stage of preservation. Tomorrow he would rinse them and hang them to dry in the sun and wind. In a few days, they would be hard and dry, ready to store. When he wanted to use them, a long soak in fresh water would restore them to cookable condition. The afternoon heat drove Thomas indoors, where he occupied himself with correspondence and record keeping. The lighthouse required detailed records, weather observations, oil consumption, ships sighted, maintenance performed. The lighthouse board used these records to track expenses and plan for future needs. In his personal journal, Thomas wrote more freely. July 15, 1873. The summer heat brings a different quality to life here. The sea becomes a constant temptation, its cool waters calling. I have taken to swimming in the early morning when duties permit. There is a small cove, sheltered from the main currents, where the water is calm and clear. To float in the salt water, looking up at the sky, feeling the gentle rock of the swells, it is as close to perfect peace as I have found. The garden is producing abundantly now. I have more vegetables than I can eat fresh, so I have begun preserving them for winter. green beans pickled in vinegar, cucumbers made into pickles, tomatoes canned in glass jars. The pantry is beginning to fill with the summer's bounty, each jar a promise of good eating in the cold months ahead. As evening approached, the heat began to break. A breeze picked up from the northeast, bringing cooler air and the smell of rain from somewhere over the horizon. Thomas walked through his garden, watering the plants that showed signs of stress from the heat. The tomatoes especially needed attention, their large leaves drooping in the afternoon sun. The bean plants were heavy with pods, and Thomas picked a basket full for dinner. Some were getting too large and tough, so these he would leave to dry on the vine for winter soup beans. The summer squash were producing faster than he could eat them, their yellow flowers opening each morning to welcome the bees. The evening lighting came with a spectacular sunset. Clouds had built up in the west, and the sun painted them in shades of orange, pink, and purple that seemed impossible in their vividness. Thomas lit the beacon as the colors were at their peak, the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly sweep just as the first stars appeared. Dinner was simple but satisfying: fresh cod fried in butter, green beans from the garden, and new potatoes boiled with mint. Thomas ate slowly, savoring the fresh flavors. Through the window, he watched as the twilight deepened and more stars emerged. The summer triangle, Vega, Altair, and Deneb, was rising in the east, a celestial landmark as reliable as any lighthouse. After dinner, Thomas decided to take an evening walk. The heat had broken completely now, and the air was comfortable. He walked along the cliff path, listening to the evening sounds, crickets beginning their chorus, an owl calling from the woods, the eternal sound of waves on rocks. At a bend in the path, he surprised a deer drinking from a small spring. It looked at him for a long moment, water dripping from its muzzle, before bounding away with a flash of white tail. Thomas waited quietly, and soon two more deer appeared, a doe with a half-grown fawn. They were more cautious, testing the air for danger, but eventually they too drank and moved on. Back at the lighthouse, Thomas climbed to the watchroom for his evening observations. He had developed a habit of spending an hour here each evening, writing in his journal, reading, or simply watching the beam sweep around its circle. Tonight he brought up his telescope, a good brass instrument he'd purchased with his savings. Through the telescope, he could see details invisible to the naked eye. The craters on the moon, just past first quarter, stood out in sharp relief. Jupiter was rising, and he could make out its four largest moons, tiny points of light discovered by Galileo centuries ago. The Andromeda galaxy was just a fuzzy patch to the naked eye, but through the telescope, it showed its elongated shape. A ship passed close enough that Thomas could read its name through the telescope, Mary Catherine out of Boston. He made a note in the log, another ship guided safely by his light. The captain flashed a lantern 3 times, a salute to the lighthouse keeper. Thomas responded by briefly covering and uncovering one of the windows, sending his own greeting across the dark water. As July gave way to August, Thomas noticed the subtle signs that summer had peaked and was beginning its slow decline toward autumn. The days were still warm, but they were noticeably shorter. The sun set earlier each evening, and dawn came later each morning. The angle of light was different too, more golden, less harsh than the high summer sun. On this August morning, Thomas woke to find a heavy dew had settled during the night. Every spider web was outlined in tiny diamonds of water, creating natural art throughout the garden. The grass was so wet it soaked through his boots as he walked to the lighthouse for the dawn extinguishing. The light had burned perfectly through the night, the wicks requiring only minor trimming. As Thomas covered the lens with its protective curtain, he noticed a migration of small birds passing, warblers heading south already, though summer seemed far from over. After breakfast, porridge with fresh blackberries he'd picked the previous evening, Thomas set about one of the major tasks of late summer, painting. The lighthouse required regular painting to protect it from the corrosive salt air. The lighthouse board specified that the tower be painted every 2 years, but Thomas touched up problem areas annually. He mixed the paint carefully, white lead, linseed oil, and turpentine in the proper proportions. The paint had to be thin enough to apply easily but thick enough to provide protection. Thomas had learned the right consistency through experience, stirring until it would drip from the stick in an unbroken stream. Starting at the top of the tower and working down, so any drips would fall on unpainted surfaces, Thomas began the methodical work of painting. The brush moved in long, even strokes, covering the weathered paint with fresh white. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative. Dip, apply, smooth, move to the next section. From his position on the scaffolding, Thomas had a magnificent view. He could see for miles in every direction, the endless sea to the east, the forested coast to the west, the scattered islands to the north and south. A schooner was beating upwind, tacking back and forth as it made slow progress against the breeze. By noon, Thomas had completed one section of the tower. He climbed down for lunch and a rest, his arms tired from the reaching and brushing. Paint speckled his clothes and hands despite his care. The turpentine smell clung to him, sharp and resinous. Lunch was eaten on the porch, a sandwich of thick bread and cheese, sliced tomatoes from the garden with salt, and cool water from the spring. The tomatoes were at their peak now, red and ripe, bursting with flavor. Thomas had never tasted tomatoes like this before keeping the lighthouse. Store-bought ones in the city had been pale shadows of these sun-ripened fruits. The afternoon was spent on less strenuous tasks. Thomas harvested herbs from his small herb garden: sage, thyme, rosemary, and oregano. These he would dry for winter use, hanging them in bundles from the rafters of the storage shed where air could circulate around them. He also collected seeds from the flowers that grew around the lighthouse. His predecessor had planted many of them, and Thomas had added to the collection. Black-eyed Susans, coneflowers, and coreopsis would self-seed, but Thomas liked to collect some seeds to plant in specific locations. He stored them in small envelopes, carefully labeled, for planting next spring. As evening approached, Thomas prepared for the weekly task of winding the fog signal. Though rarely needed in summer, the fog signal had to be kept ready for use. It was a mechanical horn, powered by compressed air, that would sound a distinctive pattern to warn ships in poor visibility. The mechanism was complex, requiring careful maintenance. Thomas oiled the gears, checked the air pressure, and tested the horn with a single blast that echoed across the water. Several seals that had been basking on nearby rocks slipped into the water at the sound, looking reproachfully in his direction. The evening lighting proceeded as usual, but tonight Thomas noticed that he needed to light the beacon a few minutes earlier than the week before. Summer was definitely waning. The wicks caught easily, the flames merging into the brilliant light that would shine until dawn. Dinner was a celebration of the garden's abundance, a salad of lettuce, tomatoes, and cucumbers, green beans with butter and herbs, new potatoes roasted with rosemary, and for dessert, a bowl of blackberries with cream from the Davidsons' farm. After dinner, Thomas sat in the parlor working on his ship model. He was adding the final details now: tiny cleats and blocks, miniature barrels and coils of rope on the deck. The work required a magnifying glass and steady hands, but the result was remarkably realistic. As he worked, memories surfaced of his younger days when he'd considered going to sea. Many young men from coastal Maine did, signing on to merchant ships or fishing vessels. But the war had intervened, and afterward, Thomas had wanted solid ground beneath his feet. Still, he understood the appeal of the sea, the call of distant horizons. The midnight check found everything in order. The night was clear and calm, with a crescent moon setting in the west. Venus was brilliant in the evening sky, and Mars was rising in the east, distinctly red even to the naked eye. Thomas stood on the gallery for a moment, breathing the cool night air, feeling the slight vibration of the clockwork mechanism through the floor. September arrived with a distinct change in the air. Though the days were still warm, the nights had turned cool enough to require a blanket. The leaves on the deciduous trees were beginning to show hints of color, a touch of yellow here, a blush of red there. Autumn was approaching, Thomas's favorite season on the coast. On this September morning, Thomas woke to the sound of geese flying south. Their honking calls carried clearly in the still air, and through his window, he could see their V formation dark against the lightening sky. These were the advance guard. Many more would follow in the coming weeks. After the morning lighthouse duties, Thomas decided to begin his autumn preparations. Winter on the Maine coast was serious business, requiring careful planning and preparation. He started with a thorough inspection of the keeper's quarters, looking for any repairs needed before the harsh weather arrived. The roof was his first concern. Climbing carefully with a ladder, he inspected every shingle, looking for cracks or loose nails. He found several spots that needed attention and made repairs immediately. A small leak in winter could become a major problem when ice formed and expanded. Next, he checked the windows, ensuring that all the glazing putty was intact and that the sashes moved freely. One window had a cracked pane. It must have happened recently, as he hadn't noticed it before. Thomas measured carefully and made a note to order replacement glass with the next supply run. The chimney needed cleaning, a dirty but necessary job. Thomas had the proper brushes and knew the technique, having helped his father clean chimneys as a boy. He spread canvas around the fireplace to catch the soot, then climbed to the roof with his brushes. Working the brush down the chimney with long, flexible rods, he could feel it scraping against the accumulated soot and creosote. Black debris fell into the fireplace below with soft thumping sounds. It took an hour of hard work, but when finished, the chimney was clear and safe for winter use. By noon, Thomas was covered in soot despite his precautions. He heated water on the stove and took a thorough wash, changing into clean clothes. The dirty clothes would need serious scrubbing, but that was a task for another day. Lunch was eaten while reviewing his winter supply list. He needed to order enough flour, sugar, coffee, tea, and other staples to last through the months when supply boats might not be able to reach the lighthouse. Coal for the stove, whale oil for the beacon, kerosene for the household lamps, all had to be calculated and ordered. The afternoon was spent in the garden, harvesting vegetables for preservation. The tomatoes were producing heavily now, racing to ripen before the first frost. Thomas picked a bushel basket full, selecting the ripest for immediate canning and setting aside the green ones to ripen indoors. The canning process was hot work. Thomas had learned it from a neighbor woman before taking the Lighthouse posting, recognizing it as an essential skill for self-sufficiency. He sterilized the glass jars in boiling water, filled them with peeled and chopped tomatoes, added salt, and processed them in a hot water bath. The kitchen filled with steam and the smell of cooking tomatoes. By evening, Thomas had 12 quarts of canned tomatoes cooling on the counter, their lids popping as they sealed. Each jar represented multiple meals during the winter months when fresh vegetables would be only a memory. The evening lighting came earlier now, the sun setting noticeably sooner than even a week ago. As Thomas lit the wicks, he calculated that he was now lighting the beacon almost an hour earlier than at the summer solstice. The changing seasons were measured precisely by the lighthouse keeper's schedule. Dinner was simple, as Thomas was tired from the day's heavy work. He made an omelet with eggs from his hens and herbs from the garden, eaten with thick slices of bread and butter. For dessert, he had preserved peaches from a jar he'd bought from Mrs. Davidson, sweet and perfect with cream. After dinner, Thomas sat on the porch despite the cool evening air, wrapped in a wool blanket. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, and he could see the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon. An owl hooted from the nearby woods, and he could hear small animals rustling in the underbrush. This was the deep peace he'd sought when taking this position. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of natural quiet, the small sounds of the living world going about its business without human interference. It was healing in a way Thomas couldn't fully articulate but felt in his bones. As September progressed, the days took on the golden quality particular to autumn in New England. The light was different, softer, more angled, turning everything it touched to warm amber. Thomas found himself moving more slowly, savoring these perfect days before winter's arrival. On this particular morning, Thomas woke to find the first visible frost of the season silvering the grass. It was light, just enough to whiten the ground in sheltered spots, but it was a clear signal that the growing season was ending. He would need to harvest the tender vegetables today or risk losing them. After his lighthouse duties, Thomas spent the morning in frantic but organized harvesting. All the tomatoes came off the vines, green and red alike. The squash and pumpkins were cut from their vines and arranged in the sun to cure their skins. The last of the beans were picked, and the pepper plants were pulled up entirely. They would continue ripening indoors. By noon, the porch was covered with produce. Thomas stood back to survey the harvest with satisfaction. It represented months of work and care, and it would feed him well through the winter. There was something deeply satisfying about this direct connection between work and sustenance. The afternoon was spent processing the harvest. Green tomatoes were wrapped individually in newspaper and stored in the cool cellar, where they would ripen slowly over the coming weeks. Squash and pumpkins were carried to the root cellar, arranged on shelves where air could circulate around them. Beans were spread on screens to dry, eventually to be shelled and stored in glass jars. As he worked, Thomas reflected on the cycle of seasons he was witnessing. This was his third autumn at the lighthouse, and he was beginning to understand the deeper rhythms of the place. Each season had its particular tasks and rewards, its challenges and beauties. The evening brought an unexpected visitor, a small boat approaching the lighthouse wharf. Thomas walked down to meet it, curious about who would be arriving at this hour. It turned out to be Dr. Whitman from the village, making one of his periodic checks on the lighthouse keeper's health. Evening, Thomas, the doctor called as he tied up his boat. Thought I'd come by before the weather turns. How are you keeping? Dr. Whitman was a kind man in his 60s who had taken it upon himself to check on the more isolated residents of the coast. He carried his medical bag up to the keeper's quarters, where Thomas made coffee while the doctor set up his instruments. The examination was thorough but companionable. The doctor listened to Thomas's heart and lungs, checked his eyes and ears, asked about his diet and sleep. "You're in better health than most men your age," he pronounced. "This life seems to agree with you." They sat and talked for an hour over coffee and slices of apple pie that the doctor had brought from his wife. They discussed the news from the village, the approach of winter, the doctor's experiences in the Mexican War years before Thomas's own service. "You know," the doctor said as he prepared to leave, "there are those in the village who worry about you out here alone. But I tell them you're one of the sanest men I know. Sometimes solitude is exactly what a soul needs." After the doctor left, Thomas lit the beacon with special care, thinking about the doctor's words. Solitude was indeed what his soul had needed, space to heal from the war, time to find himself again, quiet to hear his own thoughts without the noise of society. The midnight check was peaceful, the light burning steadily. Thomas stood in the lamp room, looking out at the dark sea spotted with stars' reflections. Somewhere out there, ships were making their way through the night, their crews trusting in lighthouses to guide them safely. As autumn deepened toward winter, Thomas continued his faithful service at Seal Point Light. Each day brought its small tasks and quiet satisfactions. The lighthouse stood as it had for decades and would for decades more, a constant in a changing world. The keeper's life was not for everyone. It required a certain temperament, patient, self-reliant, content with one's own company. But for those suited to it, like Thomas, it offered rewards that couldn't be measured in money or status. There was the pride of important work well done. Every night the light burned was a night that ships passed safely. Every fog signal sounded was a warning that might save lives. The keeper was a guardian, a protector, a servant of those who traveled the dark waters. There was the deep connection to nature, living so closely with the seasons, the weather, the wild creatures of land and sea. Thomas knew the migrations of birds, the phases of the moon, the patterns of storms. He was part of the natural world in a way that city dwellers could never be. There was the peace that came from routine and ritual. The daily lighting and extinguishing, the regular maintenance, the careful record keeping, these gave structure and meaning to the days. In a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable, the lighthouse keeper's duties were constant and sure. And there was the solitude itself, not lonely but full. Full of thought, of observation, of small discoveries. Full of the satisfaction of self-sufficiency. Full of the quiet that allowed a man to know himself, to make peace with his past, to find contentment in the present. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, think of Thomas in his lighthouse, keeping watch through the night. Think of the beams sweeping around and around, a promise of safety in the darkness. Think of the waves eternally meeting the shore, the stars wheeling overhead, the profound peace of a life lived simply and well. The lighthouse still stands, though automated now, no longer needing a keeper's careful attention. But something of Thomas and all the keepers who served remains in its stones and stairs, and the lens that still focuses light across the waters. Their dedication and service echo through time, reminding us that some things are worth doing not for glory or wealth, but simply because they need to be done. And so, as sleep approaches, let the rhythm of the waves carry you away. Let the turning of the lighthouse beam mark the slow passage of peaceful time. Let the image of Thomas, content in his tower, tending his light, be a gentle guardian of your dreams. The light continues to shine, steady and sure, through darkness toward dawn. And you, safe in your bed, can rest knowing that somewhere, someone is keeping watch, maintaining the light that guides us all safely home. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as peaceful as a lighthouse keeper's quiet night, filled with the gentle sounds of the sea and the steady, comforting sweep of the light across the waters. Thank you for listening to this peaceful bedtime story. May you have found the same tranquility that Thomas found in his lighthouse by the sea. Sweet dreams, and sleep well.